We're here today on October the 26th, 2022, to talk with Justice Gorman Houston, who is retired from the Alabama Supreme Court. My sister Millie Houston and I will be discussing with our father his virtually entire adult life, which was as part of the legal community, most of it here in the state of Alabama. From his time at law school at the University of Alabama until he graduated in 1956, his time when he served on the staff of the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court before he went to the Judge Advocate General's office in the United States Air Force. In 1960, he returned to his hometown of Eufaula, Alabama, and opened a law practice where he practiced for 25 years until in 1985, Governor George C. Wallace appointed him as an Associate Justice to the Alabama Supreme Court. He served on the Supreme Court and ultimately became the Senior Associate Justice and served an interim as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. When he reached the retirement age, mandatory retirement age in the state of Alabama, he retired from the Supreme Court, but not from the legal profession. He went on staff of a law firm in Birmingham until he retired just a few years ago. That's an awful lot, and virtually all of his adult life. My sister Millie and I will be talking with our dad about the motivators and influencers and guides, the people who attracted him into the legal profession and shaped and influenced both his legal philosophy and his practice of law. So we'll begin at the top, and I'll ask you, which of the United States Supreme Court Chief Justices has had the greatest influence on your philosophy and practice of law?
I was born on March the 11th, 1933, and I was surprised to learn that I was older than two of the justices who were on the United States Supreme Court at that time. And one was Antoine Scalia, who was born on March the 11th, 1936, 3 years after I was born, and the other was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was born on March the 15th, 1933, 4 days after I was born. I was pleased to learn that Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg were the best of friends, and they had different judicial philosophies, more than miles apart. Justice Scalia was a conservative, and Justice Ginsburg was a liberal. I admire both of them, and they remain two of my very favorite justices.
Okay, that's great. Well, let's talk a little bit about the influences that led you to pursue a life in the legal profession, I guess from your earliest days, perhaps, growing up in Eufaula, Alabama. How did you make your way into the legal community?
Well, I was very close to my grandfather, who was a doctor, Dr. James Lafayette Houston. And I lived next door to him at the Bluff City Inn in Eufaula, which he owned. And I spent a lot of time with him. When I was 2 years old, I remember that Dr. Houston bought a large cotton plantation, which was closer to Eufaula than the many farms that he owned near Coma, Alabama, and he named it the Jackson Place. And the first time Dr. Houston took me to the Jackson Place, he had a person who worked in the hotel to drive us. And he sat in the back seat, and I stood next to him, and he had his arm around me, and I had my hand on his shoulder, and we went over a bridge that had a horrible noise, and I'd grabbed my grandfather just as strong as I possibly could to try to get something contained. And all of a sudden, here came this voice, "Shall we gather at the river, the beautiful river, gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God." And I calmed down and was fine after that song. And we sang it every time we went over that bridge. Back and forth, we would sing that song. And it was a good encouragement for me. And what I would have to do there, I would play with the children whose parents had picked the cotton and whose my grandfather had weighed and paid for the cotton. And I was 4 years old when Linus was asked to take my grandfather to Middle Florida to visit his two sisters. And he was driving there, and they had no cattle law back then, and cattle were in the roadway. He pulled out of the road to try to miss one and hit a tree. And my grandfather was injured, and very seriously so. They brought him to Eufaula, and he was in the hospital on the bluff in Eufaula. And my daddy picked me up and took me to see him. And I looked at him there. His eyes were closed. He wasn't saying anything, of course. And I realized later that he was dying. And I started crying, and that was it. I remember it was awfully hard to take. And I just remember that as something that I will never forget.
And Daddy, after Dr. Houston's death, his will was set up in a way, of course it was unexpected, but he did have a will. And how did that impact the family?
Well, it had a very serious impact on the family, as you all will probably know. He was worth a great deal of money, because really your land at that time was, was the thing you really wanted to have. We didn't have much of a stock market, and he just he had it maintained. The strange thing about it is that when I grew older, I was told by people in the barber shop, which was part of the Bluff City Inn on the ground floor, that was owned by my grandfather, that he had left the Jackson place to me. And that he had told all of them there that he had left the Jackson place to me. And of course, this was several years after his death, and I never challenged that. I never saw the will, never saw his will. But it was an interesting experience.
But his will left the property to his sons, and then to all three of his sons.
Well, he left them to his life estate, to his wife, and to his three sons.
Right.
And then it went to, their children and so forth.
And so in your family, your father died early in his 40s, and instead of it passing down to your mother, it actually went to you and your brother and sister.
That's correct.
How did that affect your family?
Well, we helped my mother to make sure that everything was all right there. And it was right hard. Actually, my father managed everything. He managed the hotel, and he managed the farms in Coma and the Jackson place. And so he was in charge of it. He was actually climbing a fence with a loaded gun when it went off and hit him right in the neck. And he died. He was by himself. He was going across to a pond that we had to fish. And it was
And
actually.
you were in law school at
I
the
was in
time.
law school at the time. And so we found that out. And an interesting thing happened. Hank and Louise Connor lived 2 doors down from my parents, and they were close friends with my parents for a long time, and they became particularly close after this. And Hank took the bloody clothes of my father to their attic and put it in their attic because we did not have an attic in the house that would protect it, you know. So the thing that's right interested in that, they are buried next to Mama and Daddy. And it's right interesting because Nell's sister turned out to be Louise's sister
Right.
turned out to be Nell
Harper Lee.
Harper Lee. Nell Harper Lee. And we were very close to Nell Harper Lee for a long time. We would pick her up at the train station in Atlanta and bring her to Eufaula. We visited her several times in Birmingham, where she was a patient there. We visited her many times in Monroeville, and she visited me at the Supreme Court in Montgomery, and before her death, I wrote Nell Harper Lee and We for Family and Friends. This is the book that I gave to so many people that we have no more, and I gave all the letters from Nell Harper Lee to the State of Alabama Department of Archives and History, and they are listed there. One letter that struck me mightily was ended, "Lastly, thank you for you. So long as you are around, there will be one voice of reason, sanity, and Christian principle. My love to you and Martha, Nell." And that is a
great
treasure.
tribute.
A treasure.
That's
that-
right.
that-
That's a great tribute.
yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about the role of faith in your life. You've been active in the church all your life. Has that had an influence of your decision to enter law, to pursue justice and so forth? Or tell us about your faith.
I'm not as good as I should be. That is a fact now. And I spend less time with the church. We used to open the church and close the church for many, many years there in Eufaula and even in Montgomery when we were up here. But we just sort of got tired. Sort of
Daddy, your personal faith,
personal
which
faith.
guided.
Yeah. But we just were
Very active.
very active.
And the faith was very strong. There were probably various people, pastors and bishops and lay people who influenced you greatly in all of that.
Another person who influenced me greatly was you, who went into the ministry. And we made sure we attended church that you had any time that we possibly could, and enjoyed it very much. But it is a part of my life, a big, big part of my life, and a big, big part of Martha's life. And we're in Millie's backyard, and we hear the chimes every 15 minutes from the place that is there, First Methodist Church, that is, I guess they're situated at the Calvarium, aren't they?
They're in a tower.
On the top of it, yeah. So anyway, there's a Calvarium that we will be buried in, and it's just interesting to be able to sit in Millie's backyard on wonderful furniture and listen to the chimes ring every 15 minutes. You have to kind of be religious to do that.
Well, and neither you nor our mother has spent a lot of time telling everybody how strong their faith is. You just lived it out.
Well, I'm not sure we lived it out, but she did, but she has, but I have not. But anyway, I try.
There you go. Well, let's talk about those years. You mentioned some of the growing up memories you have. What do you think influenced you to pursue law school, to go into law school? There were easier ways to make a living, but how did you choose that?
I'm not sure exactly. I went to Auburn. Daddy, my father, whom I was very close to, he went to Auburn, and I went to Auburn, and I pledged the same fraternity that he had pledged, and was very active in that. And it just was an interesting time to be there. But I realized all of a sudden that I wanted to go to law school, and I don't know exactly where it came from or why, but it was strong. And I applied to the university and was accepted. And I remember my father was very pleased with that, and he actually favored that, and we thought that it was something, you know what I mean, that we would enjoy.
Right.
I was picked as one of the 4 of the senior class at law school to appear before the Alabama Supreme Court. The Chief Justice and the court came up to Tuscaloosa and had a particular ceremony that we went through. And anyway, the 2 of us,
Trial, wasn't it?
yeah, the mock trial, that we won, the one trial I was on, and Chief Justice Livingston offered me a job as his clerk, and I accepted that and went there to Montgomery, which was, and the clerk's office was right next to the Supreme Court building then, the old building, and I was over at the old building a lot at the time, as well as this part of the building.
And so you clerked there for about a year, is that right? And then
Almost a year, and then I went to the Air Force.
Right.
And was a legal officer in the Air Force, Judge Advocate General, and was there for 3 years. And it was there that you were born.
Right.
And you were born, and Millie was born when we were there in Montgomery. You were born when we were in the Air Force. And it just so happened that the time that you were supposed to be born, we made arrangements so that Millie could go to Eufaula and be with Martha's mother and her. And you didn't come. So Easter happened, and Martha hadn't gotten her Easter dress, so she had a big hat, I remember that, and she decided that she would decorate it a little for us to go to church. So she did with yeah, just flowers, altar flowers. And we went in, everything was fine. We were seated, the singing was over, And just about that time, buzz, and a bee flew out of the flower and around the church. And everybody in the church was, doing like that. And Martha was climbing under the pew almost. And anyway, you came the next day, hurriedly. I took her to the hospital, and before I could get all of the things handled there, you were born, and they were bringing you out, and we were not planning to name you the third, but you looked exactly like your father, my father did, when you were born. And so we insisted on, being James Gorman Houston III.
So your time there in the Air Force, I think at one point you told me that some of the grim work was like making wills for soldiers who would go to Vietnam and so forth. Any other memorable times there necessarily in the Air Force?
Well, I was a first lieutenant and ended up as a captain. But Martha, for example, was president of the Wives Club, and she was at the house where the wife of the highest man on the base stayed, and she was a good friend of her. They played golf together and what have you. Anyway, so I would be called to come over there, and it was interesting to see. And
had a good connection.
Had a good connection there, right.
So you moved from being with the Air Force back to your hometown. Again, your father had died, your mother was there, and your younger brother, and so forth. And so you moved back and opened a law practice there. Yes. And so tell us some things about establishing a law practice in 1960.
Well, it was rather interesting. We were just, it would be everything from actual, trials to preparation of all sorts of closing things, deeds and things of that nature.
So you did just about every type of law.
Every type, okay. It surely was.
And you moved to Eufaula about the time the Chattahoochee River was dammed up and the lake was formed.
That's right.
About the time the civil rights movement was getting going. All sorts of things that had huge influence on that small town.
That's right.
Any reflections on how that town shaped or determined, and those events shaped or determined your practice of law?
Well, it shaped and determined in a strange way. And that on one day I was hired to go to Atlanta with clients who owned a large tract of timberland in Barber County, and they were selling it to a company there in Atlanta. So we got on the road, and they had somebody who took us up there from Eufaula, a patient, drove us up, and then we got there. We finished the work that we had to do. I received a call from Martha saying, "Gorman, I've just talked to Governor George Wallace, and he wants to appoint you to the Alabama Supreme Court. But you have got to be on the steps of the Capitol by 6 o'clock tonight." Said it is absolutely essential, or it all may fall apart, And so I was sort of astounded. I went and talked to my clients first, and they said, by all means go, you know what I mean? And they had somebody to take them back to Montgomery, back to Eufaula. And I had the people who found out about it at the law firm. They were the nicest thing in the world. They called the airport. They reserved a plane. They had somebody to get me out to the airport. And Millie came and picked me up and carried me to the steps of the Capitol. And there I was named as, you know.
So it sounds like it was total surprise.
Absolute total surprise, all in half a day is
That's
what
right.
it amounted
That was
to.
in 1985.
That's right, in 1985. And then that was it.
Yeah.
So,
And so then let's step back for one more second to your time practicing law. Prior to being on the court, you had done both plaintiff work and defense work.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
As well as lots of land titles and deeds and work of that nature, setting up estates, working a lot with the county
right.
and with the city, particularly
I was
industrial.
attorney for the county board of commissioners too, and also had served as a law clerk for the city of Eufaula
And on the industrial development
on the
board.
industrial development board.
And those were times that were key for that small town in terms of industrial development and in terms of the city becoming more prosperous.
Right.
A lot of the land had been, the United States government, I guess, had to purchase land in order to flood it for the lake that was begun.
Yeah.
Were you involved in any of that or no?
I was not involved in actually doing it, but I was involved in having it done to us.
Okay.
So we received good money for it, you know.
So some of those farmlands that your grandfather had purchased and owned were flooded. And so then the land was condemned by the government and purchased. Okay, yeah. And so then go through all of that, and you land at the Supreme Court here in Montgomery.
Right.
Okay, and that was in 1985, and you were on the court for 20 years, roughly, right?
Exactly.
Okay, and so let's talk about influences in those years. Any particular justices or others that you became close to or that you enjoyed working with?
Yes, well, most of them I enjoyed working with. And I have the, let's see, I was on, I've forgotten exactly how many courts, but we would, you know, be a different court every time one person would change
Right.
a position. And I was on at least 15 or 16.
I thought it was a lot.
So there's a lot of them. But Bo Talbot, of course, was my favorite. He was Chief Justice at the time. Sam Beatty, and people like that who had been a law professor and so forth, and was a good friend, and just a lot of them.
Right. And it's interesting to me because you had both those who would be more favor the plaintiff's viewpoint and those defense viewpoints on the court, and yet you all seem to work very well together, and kind of like you were talking about with Ginsburg and Alito working well together, even though they had different philosophies.
Exactly.
Same type thing happened here in the state?
It did happen here in the state. We did have one controversy,
Okay.
yeah, and that was the erection of the monument.
With the
in
Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandment monument.
Tell us about how that happened.
I came in from work one day. I was senior associate justice at the time. Came home from work, and the person who was in charge of the building was there at my door waiting to see me, and he said, "We've got to go down to the lobby." And so I went with him, and there in the lobby was this monument. And I was overcome with it. And the main thing, I wanted to make sure that none of the building had been destroyed by it. I mean, it was a heavy thing, you know. So I had him, and he and I went to make sure, followed tracks and made sure that there was no problem, and got some people up to look at it. And we did that.
And there was no damage,
There
right?
was no damage from that, but it was a terrible damage with everything else that was going on.
So after that, it was in the rotunda area, right? The lobby area, very public area. And after that, as I understand or remember, a lawsuit was brought to have that removed. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I guess a federal court ruled it should be removed. Is that what
Court
happened?
ruled that it should be removed. Correct.
And so then it was removed? Is that what happened?
It was removed. That's right, and it was the property of the person, you know, the lawyer who had it. And of course, one thing he was claiming says, oh, the federal court has a monument to it out front of it, you know, talking about the monument in the court here. And of course, that was entirely different. I mean, that had nothing to do with what had happened, because actually there had been a suit filed against him while he had that, and there had been an order saying that he had to remove it. It had to be removed. And that was when we had the real hard time of not doing it.
Yeah.
We had people there in the yard. I mean, they would stay night and day. And we would have to go in and out, and it was like, you know, Dangerville. But it was
A tremendous demonstration.
Oh, yes.
Ongoing for days, weeks.
Oh, yes, yes.
And these were people who were supporting keeping the monument there.
As it was.
Okay. And yet there was a ruling that ordered it to be removed.
Alabama, a court had ruled, the federal state had ruled that it had to be removed.
And there was a financial penalty for not removing it every week or whatever it would go up. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Double, I think, is.
Yes, it was.
And so, but it was, and it resulted in the Chief Justice being removed from office. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so let's talk about that part of it, because there was a very different, I guess, viewpoint, philosophy there. Once he was removed, you were named interim Chief Justice. Is
That's
that
right,
correct?
yeah.
And then,
And the building was a specialty for me, because when I was elected to the court, I mean, when I went on the court, we were in the old building.
right,
And I was there on the court while we drew up the plan for the new court. Everything was done for it. We would work over, you know, have pictures taken of us digging things and putting in bricks and what have you. So it was an effort by the justices on the court to try to have this new building. And it was just ridiculous that someone could come in, do something, get a court order saying you have to take it out, and have all these people just come down and just, you know, excuse me, you're really worried about some people. I worried.
and there was some worry about your own personal safety, wasn't there?
Well, yes, I had some problem with a car that was done, and with, but you know,
Right.
it didn't matter.
So the monument was not removed immediately as it was supposed to be. The Chief Justice was removed. You were named Chief Justice, and then you had to make a decision about what to do with the monument. Did you consult the other justices?
been moved.
Oh, it had been moved by then.
Yes.
Did you all consult?
Immediately.
Who made that decision?
Well, I did.
Did you do that by yourself or with the other justices?
Other justices.
Okay. And when
All of the other justices realized we would recognize that, you see what I mean, as something that should not have been
Right.
done. And whether we agreed with it or not, it was a court order that had been issued, and we were going to obey that court order.
So the issue here was not your religious position necessarily, but it was your respect for the rule of law.
Exactly.
Okay. And so then that was removed and ultimately returned to the owner?
Owner. And as I understand it, he made a good bit of money out of it with a trailer, taking it up and down all over the United States,
And
I
so
guess.
political rallies.
Political
and that sort of
rallies.
thing.
But I mean, they had big rallies out in front of the court. It was rather amazing.
When the monument came in, were all the justices consulted and notified so that they knew that it was coming, or was it a surprise?
No, none of us were.
Oh,
Only he knew
okay.
that it was coming in.
And you all did not see it going in?
No, it went in at night.
Okay.
Went in at night, and the thing that it's a beautiful building, you know, and it has a beautiful area there in the that in which the monument was placed, and I just was afraid that the floor was going to be ruined for having gotten it in there, but somehow they did it without damage to the building.
That's really good. Well, that was quite an event, right?
An event, yes.
And then you were Chief Justice for the remainder of that term until a new Chief Justice was elected. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so when you look back on the entire scope of the 20 years or so you were on the court, any other memories or reflections that would be important?
Only good ones.
There you go.
That's the only bad reflection I had, but that was scary. That was scary, and it just worried me for what would happen. And we were fighting the federal court. You know what I mean? And we don't do that.
Right. Difficult to ignore an order if you are then going to expect people to obey your orders, right?
Yes.
So that was a fascinating chapter in the history of the court and of that whole movement, I guess. You all did not always, the justices did not always agree on every matter.
No.
Was that a weakness or a strength of the court?
It's a strength. In other words, we see things differently. And most of the time we can make an adjustment to something that needs to be changed and modified. I used to always say, now look, if you're worried about the way I phrase this, you know, let's change. We can change it, but I'm not going to change the principle of it.
Right.
In other words, it's going to remain the same, but how it is phrased we can work with. But
that sounds like a very good collegial approach.
we had a wonderful collegial approach. This was the only time on the court that we had any kind of trouble whatsoever, and it was actually against the federal court here.
Right.
Is what it was, and just disregarding what it had done. So it was just wrong.
And so the court, it seems, then once all of that passed, returned to the good collegial approach in the remainder of your time on the court.
Yes, we did. Right.
That's good. Let's talk for a minute about then, and we'll see what sort of influence this may have had on your understanding or your legal philosophy or your practice of law. Let's start with like the feminist movement. There's been a big change since you came into practicing law in the role that women have, both in practicing law and being in judicial circles and so forth. Has that been a big change, a big stretch, or has that sort of been a natural progression?
It's been a natural progression for me. It's just a slow regression, a slow progression. But it was good that it came, and it certainly was helpful.
And the same with the civil rights movement. I know it was
exactly.
Right. Any particular memories of things there that?
No, I don't remember those exactly. I remember the things about the court because I have pictures of each court except the one with the
with the Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments person on it in my condo down at the beach and in the office right across the street here. And so I look at it every day to think about the people, and so many of them are dead, because time does pass, but it's just wonderful to
and those
have
are all
worked
fond
with those
memories,
people.
working with each of those courts.
Yes, exactly.
That's good. Any other influences that you can think of that were strong in how you practiced law or how you served decisions you made?
I don't think so.
Okay. One last thing I'll ask about all of that is, You're pretty well known for writing beautiful opinions. I have people all the time telling me that some of them have saved those opinions. They were so well written, and they reference scripture, or they reference literature, and so forth. Tell us about your approach to writing the opinions, the ones you wrote.
It was just the approach I took. I mean, it's part and parcel of who I am, I think, because I certainly didn't try to
Right,
do something.
to decorate it.
I wasn't trying to decorate. I was just trying to put in it what I thought needed to be there.
But you drew from what, Daddy? You've always loved to write.
Yeah.
Classic literature, scripture,
Right.
other opinions that have been written.
Other opinions, right. And well, that's pretty much it.
Is it safe to say you spent a good bit of time working on those opinions?
Some more than others. I mean, some were just hard to decide, others were not, and hard to write, and others were not. But it can be done if you just set about doing it.
Let's talk about your role as a bar commissioner for a number of years. Do you remember what particularly you had to do by what were some of the duties you had?
Well, we had the office right next to the old courthouse in Montgomery, and which was also the building that I went into when I went on the court, and there we were just trying to take care of the law as it would be throughout the state, and trying to make sure that everybody adhered to, the law.
Right. And that involved reading an awful lot of bar exams, didn't it?
It did. Yeah. Tremendous number of bar exams.
Right. And so for a number of years, yeah.
Which section of the bar were you an examiner for, Dad?
Several.
Was it?
Yeah, I did not just
Was
have.
one decedent's estates?
Decedent's estates were definitely one of them, but there were several over the course of the years.
And so in many ways, you were very involved in deciding who was able to be admitted to the bar because you were one of the examiners, correct? Yeah. Well, that is a fascinating role you served in that time.
Dad, tell us a little bit more about your relationship with Harper Lee. I know you met her when you were very young, but as you got older and she published To Kill a Mockingbird, did you see her pretty regularly?
Yes, we would see her very regularly for a while. And a lot of times we would go to the beach and stop by Monroeville to see her on the way, coming back or going to the beach. So we maintained a good relationship for a long period of time. She got well, right before she died, she was having a little problem.
But you, even in Eufaula, when you were growing up, you would see her.
Oh, yes.
Some there.
Yes. She was, we were close to the Connors always, because when we were in Eufaula, we were on Cherry Street and they were on Carlby Street, which was a block apart. And then when they both built houses on Country Club Road right together, and she had a little place in the yard where she worked. I mean, a little building there, structure. So.
And so Louise Connor was Harper Lee's sister.
That's right.
And the name Jean Louise for Scout in the book is after Louise.
Right.
And so 2 doors down from your mother's house.
Exactly.
And so they were in and out. And then, as I recall, Nell Harper Lee would come to Eufaula, particularly holiday time and all, because that was a good place to celebrate with all the children that Louise and Hank had. Is that right?
Exactly. That was right.
Well, that's kind of a fun relationship to have nurtured through the years. And then all of the letters you sent back and forth, the correspondence, that sort of immortalized that relationship.
I thought it was good to have it preserved in the Department of Archives and History, you know, for those. But I thought we needed something also to, other than that, and that's the reason I did this Nell Harper Lee and we, because we had, and I'm ended up with this. It's the only one I have. I bet I had 150 or so, or more than that, probably published. But people wanted it, and I was glad to, you know, give it to them. But I may need to print it some more, because I may need to, because it has everything about her.
But from the excerpt that you read, when she talked about how you stood for these things, did you know those were important to her? The rule of law, you know?
I didn't particularly think of her, you know, being important, but I was just shocked when I received that in the letter.
And in many ways, her book, which was published in 1960, is that correct? Right in there.
Yeah.
May have had as much to do with giving, in many ways, advancing the civil rights movement as just about anything else, because here you had a small town attorney who took an unpopular position of defending someone who needed defending and who was wrongly accused.
Right.
And even though that trial did not turn out as we would hope it would, nevertheless, the drama in all of that played out much of what was going on in the South and in Monroeville and in Barber County and in Eufaula and other places, right? So in many ways, that book influenced many of us.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And continues to.
Let's talk a little bit about other influences. I remember in your office in the court, in your private office, you had a little plaque there that you placed on the wall that said, from the scripture, from the book of Micah, that said, "What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God?" How did you choose that? Why did you put that in your office?
My favorite Bible verse, I think. Or one of them anyway. But I've always liked it. And
in many ways, some people think it's the thesis of the entire Bible, that all of the Bible, all of the Ten Commandments, all of the Gospel is about our own lives, seeking justice, doing mercy, and walking with great humility with our God. And certainly that seems to be the way you have lived your life.
well, appreciate it. Thank you for saying that.
In your decision to, in fact, I think it even guided your decision to come back to Eufaula. You were leaving the Judge Advocate General's office in the United States Air Force, and there were offers to go to booming cities like Houston and other places where you would have been part of a large law firm. But you chose to go and start a law practice in the sleepy little town of Eufaula. Tell us what motivated that.
Well, Martha wanted to go to Houston. And I thought it was probably a pretty good idea. But it did have my mother, you know, was still there.
And she was widowed.
And widowed, and Celeste was in and out of there, my sister. And so we just, and Martha's family, brothers and so forth, and Clara were there. And we just felt like we needed to come back there.
Okay, so came back because of the family ties and needs.
Right.
Primarily, yeah. And it ended up being a good decision in many ways. A little sleepy Eufaula kind of woke up. You all may have been part of the waking up of Eufaula, but the Corps of Engineers was a big part of that, weren't they?
It helped them.
As the lake was formed.
And of course they were condemning property like RIP, you know, and we owned a lot of that property that
Was condemned, but now the lake is over it. Mhm.
Now the lake is over it, is right. But,
So all of a sudden, people in Eufaula had money, cash money.
right.
And so no wonder there was investment in new banks and new opportunities that came about, right?
It did, and a lot of people with money came to Eufaula at that time.
Okay.
It was right interesting. It isn't changed now. It's back the way that it was.
That's right.
They are redoing the hotel, though,
Where you grew up.
where I grew up, and well, where I started anyway. Anyway, they are redoing that and are going to make a nice place. I loved that hotel because I'd had a second floor balcony. I ran it right out of our door. I could run in, and cars were right there, and I could run up and down the balcony and so forth. And
Right in downtown.
right in downtown, and I would have a nurse who would help me some when I didn't have Limas all the time, and we would go to the theater, which was half a block from there, and I enjoyed sitting in the balcony seats, which we did because
It was segregated at the time.
but I thoroughly enjoyed being in the balcony. And, you know, I really preferred doing that rather than going with my parents to see it, having to sit downstairs. But it was just little things like that that happened. And of course, there beside it is this huge Confederate monument that stands facing the river. And it's right by it, and that, underneath that was the place that we used as a playground.
Oh, I declare.
And that would be our place to bring people from their homes. Most of them lived in regular homes, not in hotels, you know. So we would go to that spot, big spot behind the Confederate monument.
And you lived in the hotel because your dad was running it?
He was running it, and he wanted to, and my grandfather wanted me there.
And he and his wife lived there.
Yeah.
But there weren't other apartments that other people.
Oh yes, there were. There were several older women
Okay.
who did not have a husband or something and needed
They
some
lived.
help. And they had a wonderful bar, and they had lifts. You know, to take, you could get, the tray would come up in a lift.
Right.
And I was able to monitor with one of my nurses riding up and down the lift.
Oh, I declare. Like a dumbwaiter.
Like a dumb waiter. That's what it was, you know, and so we'd go from the first floor up to the second. It wouldn't go all the way to the third floor.
Right.
But it would go from those two floors. And so it was interesting, you know, being able to do that, and then all of a sudden go to somewhere where you just had a house and a yard made it kind of different.
Lots of stairs at the hotel, lots of things to do, seeing people.
Seeing people and good food. I mean, we always had good food.
Well, you mentioned about segregation. That was pretty tightly enforced, I guess. And then while you were practicing law, most of those signs disappeared. Right. Most of those restrictions disappeared. There was great discord about that. Any insight into that needed to happen, should have happened, or concerns about it, or where were you in that?
I would go to several of the churches. I remember frequently going to the Catholic Church when they would have some people who were having problems, you know, and that had been, my other grandparents lived right across the street from that.
From Redeemer Catholic Church.
Redeemer Catholic, up the road, up the hill, and it would be, we would just go in and visit with the priest and have a good time with it. But it just, Eufaula was a fine place. We enjoyed it very much, and it still is.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place, wonderful memories from there, right? Then any other influences as you think back of either people or events that really had a strong influence on the court or on your philosophy or your practice?
Well, on the courts, there were several justices whom I really respected.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just thought that they handled their cases wonderfully well and were beautifully presented, and I just, admired them very much. That would be the main thing.
The earliest memory I have of doing any campaigning was when you had me in front of the A&P handout cards for Howell Heflin for Chief Justice. So that was a fun time too, wasn't it?
And Howell Heflin was a very good person. I enjoyed him very much.
And he had a huge influence on the state.
Yeah.
And then Frank Johnston had a huge influence on the state.
He surely
In fact, I wonder what would have happened had we not had a judge like him.
I don't know, but thank goodness we did have it. And Martha and I walk around this block twice a day, and we always pay attention to the monuments,
Right.
what I mean, proclaiming him.
Right.
And
He made a huge
he made a huge difference. He surely did.
And I know those were not easy days for him. No. And talk a little bit about if you were offering any guidance to someone who was interested in the law. Any words of insight or that you would offer?
I think you would need to know that you need to work hard.
Okay.
You would need to be very careful in how you presented things.
Mm-hmm. But real attention to detail.
Real attention to detail.
And yeah, and then how about anything bother you about the law these days? Any aspects? I see all these advertisements on television, and I think that has changed a lot from the day. Any part of the legal community that you find troubling, or any aspects or movements within it?
Not that I can think of right now. There are a lot of things I don't want to watch, and don't watch.
Right. I remember when you moved to a new office in Eufaula, you were extremely concerned. You had a sign about this big outside, that sign might be too large, that you didn't want to be appearing to be advertising you. So things have really changed from then.
Well, that was a good building. Good building.
So your daughter went to law school.
She did.
And you obviously had great influence on her decisions doing that. I assume you were pleased with that decision?
Yes.
Okay, and anything you want to reflect on that?
Well, I was pleased with both of y'all.
Okay.
Y'all both were excellent children. And we spent $1 million educating you both. Or at least it felt like that, didn't it, Martha? Anyway, we spent plenty, but when we go to Duke and we go to all the others that you can, Virginia and all of those things, that cost a little bit of money, But
Thank goodness for Dr. Houston.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks goodness for that.
Right.
Daddy, just for a few minutes, let's talk about the clerks that you had when you were on the court. Because I know you were very careful in selecting the people you selected, and you probably saw them change. Any reflections on how you felt like they helped you or you helped them make decisions about their career?
I hope I helped them make decisions about their career, but all of them helped me. Some much more than others, but
And how, for instance?
how? Well, just they would put that extra effort in a case that needed the extra effort, and when we were writing and working on it, a lot of times that would be things, if they didn't do it, I would have to do it, you know what I mean? So it was wonderful to have them polish it off.
Right.
And
I know at least one has been on the Supreme Court.
Yes, that's right. One is still on the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Yeah, and is a senior associate justice now, I believe.
And then others went on to practice. Did any of them go to private practice?
Yes, yes, several of them went to private practice.
Danny, I have a question.
Yeah.
When, in the course of the justices looking at a case and making a decision, writing an opinion, when people disagreed with the opinion, someone would write a dissent.
That's right.
And I know that one of the cases that I've heard the most about, one of your cases that I heard the most about, was one that you dissented with the decision, with the majority, and it had to do with in a family court issue, when, whether or not the parent should be responsible for paying for college for their children, and the decision was that they should not have that responsibility. But you dissented. Do you remember that at all?
I do remember that.
And I remember it was a pretty lengthy, and it's been used a lot in trying to get that law changed, so that children can expect a little bit more than that. I think it was just that they paid, but only for the state
Right.
schools.
Yeah.
Do you remember much about that, or how you felt strongly about that, or why you felt strongly?
That right, and maybe I was wrong. I probably had more money than most of them. You know what I mean? When I was doing that, writing that, and deciding that. But I do think it was something that should have been done.
And the role of the dissent, the dissenting viewpoint, and writing that up is important, isn't it?
Oh, it is important. Yes.
To chronicle the other side of the story, what the other viewpoint would be.
That's correct. And it's essential almost to, we need to vote, on a case. You just need to vote unless there's some reason that you cannot do it, and there are reasons that you shouldn't do it, But if you can vote and should vote, you need to vote. It needs to be done and not just try to avoid it.
Right.
Because it's very necessary.
And then the arguments in favor, of course, end up in the majority opinion.
Exactly.
And then there are valid arguments on the other side that need to be noted as well.
Right.
And when people are using those decisions and, to fortify their case, that's when a dissent can be very valuable when, unexpectedly, even though it might not be the majority opinion, it could help influence a court in a different way.
Well, it has been a delight for my sister Millie and me to share with my dad this opportunity for him to reflect on his years as an attorney in small town Alabama, as a member of the Alabama Supreme Court, a brief stint as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, and a time when he was on the staff of a big city law firm. All of those he has shaped and been influenced by, and all of those he has given his very best work to. I hope you have been able to sense the faith, the courage, the attention to detail, the hard work that have defined his life and continue to do so. And I appreciate this opportunity afforded us by this project.